This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We are closing out the year of 2024, and I wanted to do a couple of retrospective top 10 videos about limited this year to close out the year. In this video, we're going to be looking at the 10 worst limited cards of the year, and in the next one, we'll look at the 10 best limited cards of the year. This type of video is useful because it helps us understand what exactly makes a card bad and what makes a card good, in the next video. As usual, I'm using 17 Lands data here to compile this list. 17lands.com is a website you can visit and sign up to have them track your data on Arena. There are lots and lots of players who do, and so we have a pretty large sample size of data for every limited format as a result. And the win rate I use to determine the order of this list is the game in hand win rate. There's no single number that's going to tell you absolutely everything about a card, and game in hand win rate isn't everything. But if you're trying to pick a single metric on 17 Lands, this is the best one because it reflects the fact that some cards get stuck in your hand. Game in hand win rate means it was in your hand at some point in the game. That's a much more useful tool to use than win rates that look at like when a card was played, because then you're not actually seeing the times when the card is stuck in your hand and so forth. I did limit myself to cards that people are actually playing. There are cards with lower win rates or that don't even have enough data to calculate a win rate, but these are cards that people obviously know are bad because people aren't playing them. 17 Lands users at least aren't playing them. Whereas the cards in this list are all cards that have been significantly played. Sometimes they've been played a lot. So it's more useful to look at these kinds of cards that people, at least some people, seem to think are actually good, even though they're, not. So, and for all these cards on this list, it's easy to understand to some extent why people thought they were good, and I'm going to sort of explain what exactly makes these cards bad despite first appearances. All right, I do have one honorable mention, and it's because it's a card that always ends up being overrated by people, and one that anytime it or a card like it is in a set review, I get a lot of pushback when I give it an F, but it is in fact an F, and that card is Swiftfoot Boots from Foundations. It has a win rate of 43.7%, which is absolutely abysmal. The average win rate for a 17 Lands user in most formats is about 55%. And once you dip below that 55%, especially by 1 or 2 points, you're starting to talk about cards that are questionable in most decks, whether you should play them. Once you get into the 40s, you're talking about cards that are unplayable. And Swiftfoot Boots is certainly that. And I understand why people overrate this card, especially if, you mostly just play limited at pre-releases and stuff like that. You don't play limited all the time. And you play other formats like Commander or 60-card formats where this is actually kind of good. And what makes Swiftfoot Boots good is that it can protect your win condition, it can protect your super powerful creature because it gives it, hexproof and haste. Even lets it swing right away because of that last part. The problem is you virtually never see an aura or equipment in limited that actually succeeds if it requires that the creature already be good. This is because the power level's lower in limited on average. Sure, you might have a bomb, and if you can put this on this, that's pretty great. But you're going to find yourself without anything meaningful to put this on way more often than you will find a good use for it, as this win rate clearly indicates to you. You just can't have cards that already require your creature to be good like this because they end up not being worth a full card effectively when you don't have a decent creature. I mean, putting this on your 2/2, not going to move the needle at all. It doesn't augment your creature. It doesn't make it a better attacker. It doesn't make it a better blocker. It doesn't give you any sort of value except your creature can't be targeted and maybe it can swing right away, but that's not great either. So overall, Swiftfoot Boots is a bad card. It has the 11th lowest win rate of the year, so it didn't quite make the top 10, but it is bad and limited. It and all of its variants, we see them sometimes where they give ward or whatever too. Like I said, one sort of rule of thumb that I've never seen overcome by any card is if this equipment or aura requires my creature to already be good for it to be meaningful, it's not going to be good in limited. At number 10, now that we're moving to the list proper, we've got Grievous Wound with a 43.6% win rate. It's from Duskmourn. So this is another one that I gave an F to in the set review. Got a lot of pushback, and so, it makes sense that people are playing this a lot despite its horrible win rate. And when you read this card, it sounds pretty strong, right? It enchants your opponent. The player can't gain life part, that's not that exciting and limited. But when they're dealt damage, they lose half their life rounded up. So you can really end up in a spot where you can rapidly lower your opponent's life total if you've got a Grievous Wound attached to your opponent. But it's kind of like what we saw with Swiftfoot Boots. This doesn't do anything at all unless you already have a good board state. It doesn't improve your board state in any meaningful way. I mean, it kind of can, because it means if your creatures get through, they sort of do more damage than they would otherwise do, and that's pretty cool. But it doesn't really make your board into better attackers or blockers or have any effect that does anything at all on its own. And that means a lot of the time when you play this, you're effectively mulliganing. That's kind of the truth with Swiftfoot Boots too, because it just doesn't do anything. Now, when it does do something, you were already really far ahead, and it's kind of a win more card. And so if you're at parity or you're behind, playing this probably loses you the game, because your opponent will then untap and play, random 5 mana 5/5, which is way better than this card, and they will pull way ahead of you. So, if you're behind or at parity, it's a disaster. And even if you're ahead, it's not that good, but that is when it's at its best. And so but the problem here is, this doesn't improve your board or subtract from your opponents in a meaningful way, and it doesn't do anything on its own. So it's a terrible limited card. All right, next up we have Reenact the Crime with a 43.3% win rate. This is a Karlov Manor card. So this is a card that lets you exile a non-land card in a graveyard that was put there this turn, and you copy it without paying its mana cost. So this is another one where you can look at it and you can think, you imagine these scenarios where you are casting this amazing thing that cost well more than 4 mana that went in your opponent's graveyard. But you have a situation here where limited has a lower power level, so on average, the thing that goes in your opponent's graveyard usually isn't worth more than 4 mana. Furthermore, the window on this is a big problem. We've seen, and I have myself in the past, overrated cards that have an effect like this, where there's a very narrow window about getting the card back. There's a card called Back Again or something like that from a white card. I'll put it on the screen, that whenever that card came out, quite a while ago at this point, I thought it was going to be pretty good, but because it gets you 2 creatures back from the graveyard that died this turn, which sounds insane. But Reenact the Crime has the same problem, where you have this narrow window during which you have to have this mana up and you have to have this in your hand. And something has to die. So the window may not even open to begin with. Something has to go to the graveyard. In this case, some non-land card that goes to a graveyard has to be there too. So it's just very difficult to line it up. And then the cherry on top of all of this is the triple blue mana is kind of oppressive in limited. It's very difficult to consistently leave up 3 blue mana, because if you cast some blue creature on your turn, chances are good you don't have 3 blue mana left over, for example. So this ends up stuck in your hand, unable to do something most of the time, and then even when the window opens up and you have the mana up, the thing that you can get back often isn't that good. So that results in a really bad limited card. All right, at number 8, we've got a Modern Horizons 3 card, Ripples of Undeath, with a 43% win rate. All right, so here we have another card that doesn't really add or subtract to the board. That is often a recurring theme here. For a lot of these cards, they look really cool and they do powerful things, but if you just gave me a vanilla creature with the same mana value and power and toughness each equal to that mana value, that's a way better card, and that's true here too, because you'd much rather have a 2-mana 2/2 than play Ripples of Undeath. This is one I myself overrated this year, by the way. I mean, I didn't say it was amazing, but I think I gave it a build around C+ or something, thinking it might work in the right deck. And that's because it has a powerful effect. The text box sounds pretty good. You get to mill 3 cards at the beginning of your first main phase, and if graveyard decks are into that. And then you can pay 1 generic and 3 life to put a card from among those cards into your hand. So, it's kind of like Phyrexian Arena, which itself is a card that has fallen off of late, although it is better in Foundations than it has been in the recent past. But this kind of card that doesn't add to the board, but can draw you cards while making you lose life is often a liability in modern limited formats, because you also didn't add to the board, which means you're not going to be able to trade with their 2-drop or whatever. You're just going to end up taking tons of damage. And the fact that it makes you pay 1 generic and 3 life to get something back is also a huge problem. And this ends up just being a first main phase mill 3 cards way too often, because you just don't want to pay the 3 life, or you don't have 1 generic mana lying around to draw the card to begin with. And while this sounds like it's a super sweet enabler for a graveyard deck, this card and others like it all indicate that cards that are nothing but enablers that don't also have a body, like if this was a 2-mana 2/2 with this ability, it would be great, right? That's how big of a difference having a body makes. It goes from being one of the worst limited cards of the year to probably being one of the better cards in Modern Horizons 3 if it's just a 2-mana 2/2, because it's just so much better to have a body than it is, to not have one. So in short, this doesn't add to the board, and the cost it requires of you is so great that you often just can't get things back, and all it does is mill your library. I mean, you can also add to that fact that if your opponent can stall you out, or if you draw this late enough, it'll also just mill you out in a few turns, which is even more downside, because it is not a May trigger. Next, we've got Fishing Pole, which has a 42.8% win rate. It's from Foundations. So this is in the same family as Swiftfoot Boots, in that it's an equipment that doesn't make your creature a better attacker or blocker. It does at least do something, despite having a lower win rate, in that you can spend some mana and have this start cranking out fish tokens. And this is a card, by the way, another one of these where I thought it was going to be okay-ish. Like, I think I gave it a D in the set review, which, that's not a good grade, but it's an F, a hardcore F that you should basically never play. And that's just because it asks way too much of you. It's just way too slow. Sure, you can equip it. It's relatively cheap and efficient to equip. Then you can tap your creature to put a bait counter on the fishing pole. And then, theoretically, your tapped creature will untap, and then you'll get a fish on your turn when you remove a bait counter. So, problem being, it takes a pretty long time just to get that first fish token, especially if you put this on a creature that you just cast, because it's not going to be able to tap yet. And what can be really brutal is when your opponent just kills your creature with the pole on it before it ever untaps. So you end up going through all of these motions where you paid 2 to equip it, 1 to tap your creature, and then you never get the fish token. That happens pretty often, when I've played against this card, and especially in a format that has such cheap, efficient removal that people are putting this on their X2, and you just spend 1 to blow them out in terms of mana. And then the upside just isn't that great either. Like, a 1/1 fish is fine. If this just made it so the creature pumped out a 1/1 fish every turn, that would be a lot better, but it doesn't do that. You have to do the setup by tapping the creature and putting a bait counter on it. So overall, it just ends up being too slow, and it doesn't do anything to make your creature better in a meaningful way. Next up, we've got a Bloomburrow card at number 6, that is, and that is Storm Splitter with a 42.7% win rate. It is the only creature on this list. Like I was just saying, being a creature goes a long way towards making a card a lot better, but Storm Splitter is so bad that it doesn't really matter. I mean, a 4-mana 1/4 with haste is awful, right? Like, that's a card you would play 0% of the time. And then it has this cool effect where if you cast an instant or sorcery, you get to create a token that's a copy of it. And the joke here is that you can then cast another instant sorcery and then make more copies, and it just snowballs, and eventually you have a million otter wizards going at your opponent. But there's a few things here that make this bad, despite having such a cool text box and, being a cool mythic rare. One of them is, like, a 1/4 haste, even when you've got, like, 8 of them, isn't that big of a problem. If your opponent has any creatures at all untapped, they can probably block them. And if they don't, they're taking 8 damage, and you didn't add to the board permanently in any way because these tokens are all temporary. Furthermore, the blue-red spell deck ended up being awful in Bloomburrow. So this card, which is really built around doing spell stuff and doing otter stuff, is at even more of a disadvantage. Like, maybe it wouldn't have made this top 10 if that deck wasn't also so bad, because it is a creature. It does add to the board. The problem is you're just never going to like go crazy casting a bunch of instants and sorceries in a single turn to make enough bodies. And again, even if you do, the upside is really not very good. Like, you need to cast so many instants and sorceries before all these 1/4s are a believable or relevant threat in any way, shape, or form. All right, at number 5, it's Urza's Incubator, Modern Horizons 3 card with a 42.3% win rate. So, this card, again, has a text box that sounds powerful. That's true for most of these, right? And I think that's why it's useful to look at these cards, because it lets us discuss what kinds of cards are bad despite looking like they wouldn't be, especially in other formats. A lot of these cards aren't bad, but they are in limited, and the Incubator is another one of those. Now, the whole thing here is that you decrease the cost of creature types of your choosing, of a creature type of your choosing when you play this. Now, you might be saying, well, the only reason this wasn't good in Modern Horizons 3 is because there wasn't a huge creature payoff theme. Creature types weren't a huge deal. You kind of had Eldrazi and stuff, I guess. But there's more to it than that. Namely, it's pretty rare that we see any card that purely all it does is give you a discount on other cards actually work out in limited. When I say in limited, by the way, I'm usually not talking about Cube, which doesn't have the same low power level as, typical limited formats. In Cube, some of these cards can do stuff, but especially when I'm talking about Cube, I mean vintage Cube. But Urza's Incubator and other cards that lower the cost of some cards in your deck just usually aren't worth it. And it's because, something I've said a lot in this video, they don't add to the board, they don't usually give you a card of value, and playing a creature ahead of schedule by a couple of turns isn't even always relevant, because you don't have the right creature with the right type, you don't have a card in your hand that this actually matters for. Again, if this was a creature with this ability, it'd be a whole different world. Even if it was a 3-mana 0/1 with this ability, it would be a whole different world. Like, that is a huge upgrade, just getting a 0/1. But it's not a creature. It doesn't add to the board. The discount doesn't always matter. It's a terrible top deck, too, by the way. Like, a lot of these cards are, like, you can imagine playing them on 3 and then slamming a 6-drop on turn 4. But how often does that really happen? Not very often. Things just don't line up consistently enough in limited. All right, next up we've got Kellen Joins Up, an Outlaws of Thunder Junction card with a 41.8% win rate. So this is a card where you look at the legendary creature part on it, and you probably aren't expecting to get much out of that. There are legendaries in Thunder Junction, so maybe you occasionally get a counter. I think it's pretty obvious to most people that that part of this card isn't good in limited. You're just, that part's not going to matter. But people overrate the other effect. And I think this is another one I myself gave like a C2 or something. Like, I thought it was going to be okay. That other effect being that you can exile a non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your hand, and if you do, it becomes plotted. So this is basically, it's in the same group as Urza's Incubator in a way, because all it does is give you a discount. The idea being that you pay 0 mana for this mana value 3 or less non-land card, and then you get to play it for free, albeit on the next turn. That sounds really good. And if Kellen Joins Up did that every time, where on your next turn you got a free 3-mana thing, that'd be great. Well, it wouldn't even be great. Honestly, that's an exaggeration. It would be a better card if it did that 100% of the time. But you're still just getting a discount. You're not getting, card advantage, generally, is what wins you games in limited. And a card like this doesn't actually give you that sort of advantage. It just gives you a discount. And thus, you'd have another card that isn't worth a whole card. You you need to be getting multiple counters out of this for it to feel worth a card, and that's not going to line up in limited. So the plot effect is weaker than it looks at first. It's exciting to say, hey, I'm going to play a free 3-drop on my next turn. That sounds pretty good, but that doesn't line up that often. And even when it does, you know, it's not going to be a game-changing play most of the time either. At number 3, we've got another Outlaws of Thunder Junction card. It's another round with a 41.4% win rate. So this kind of card always looks pretty exciting, and by this kind of card I mean a card that lets you blink a bunch of stuff. And that's what this does. You get to exile any number of creatures you control and then return them to the battlefield under their owner's control. So you can just spend 3 and blink your whole board, but you can repeat the process X more times. So if you put mana into the X's, you get to blink them again. And so this is a card that people look at and they imagine a scenario where they have like 3 creatures in play with enter the battlefield abilities, and they have like 6 mana. You know, like that is pretty good. If those enter triggers, or leave the battlefield triggers for that matter, if they give you something meaningful, you're certainly going to get a card worth the value. Those magical Christmas land scenarios are easy to think about. But frequently, even in this era where enters triggers are like everywhere, you have a lot of creatures that it doesn't matter if you blink them, first of all. Second of all, this requires a lot of mana and an ideal board state, all of which is asking too much in limited. At number 2, we have a Modern Horizons 3 card, Primal Prayers, which has a 40.9% win rate. So Modern Horizons 3 had this cool group of powered down versions of cards that are insanely strong from Magic's history. This one is supposed to be Alurin, and the design is really cool. Using energy to get to play things for free and at instant speed sounds cool, but guess what? This is another one of these cards that just gives you a discount. You're not going to have the creatures in hand. You're not going to, you know, if you draw this late in top deck mode, it does stone nothing. And even if you have it early, you aren't always going to have creatures to put into play. And again, when you do, it's hard for that to be worth a card worth the value. And at number 1, it's Dazzling Theater with a 39.5% win rate. It's from Duskmourn. It is a room. Most of the rooms in Duskmourn were pretty good overall. This is one I gave an F to in the set review and got a lot of pushback on, though. And that's because neither side of it does anything, basically. And that's how you end up with a win rate in the 30s. But this is, and I'm sure you saw people play the card too, it sounds exciting to give your creatures Convoke, right? Especially if your prop room can also untap your creatures. It's like you can get around the Convoke downside because you can tap all your stuff to play out a big old creature, then everything untaps and you're not defenseless. But as it has been a recurring theme on this particular video, this is also just a discount. One that is even harder to obtain than the other ones because you have to have creatures in play and you have to tap them in order to have access to this discount. And the pseudo-vigilance you get from prop room also isn't really a meaningful effect. I mean, it's pretty rare that we see a card that just gives vigilance your whole board and does nothing else. That doesn't do enough on its own. And in a lot of ways, this is worse because your creatures have to tap for a time, making them more vulnerable in a variety of situations. Though it does synergize better with the Convoke nonsense. But overall, you know, this is just a room you spend a ton of mana on, especially to unlock both sides. And it's never going to give you a card worth of value. It's virtually impossible to get a card worth of value out of Dazzling Theater and Prop Room, and that's what allows it to have the lowest win rate of any card on this list, dipping all the way down to 39.5%, which we've seen some bad win rates on here, but that one is truly abysmal. So the big takeaways here are cards that just give discounts don't tend to be good, not adding to the board is bad, and equipment that doesn't make your creature better in one way or another generally isn't worth it. So that'll do it for this video. I'll see you all in the next one where I will take a look at the 10 best cards, and in that one, we'll use that video to talk about what it is that makes a card into an insane bomb. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more about the limited format, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.